Vice President of Events for the St. John Paul II Guild of Catholic Lawyers here at the Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law. Thank you all for coming to the Mary Beer of Justice lecture. The Mary Beer of Justice Award began in 1989 and is intended to recognize and encourage lawyers and scholars who advance the pursuit of peace and justice through the law. This lecture tends to last 40 to 45 minutes, just to let you know. This semester, our speaker is Professor Regina Jefferson. Professor Jefferson joined the CUA faculty in 1992, served as Dean of the Law School from July of 2008 through June 2018 through the June 2019, and also served as the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs from 2000 to 2001. Professor Jefferson is a nationally recognized authority on pension law, employee benefits, and tax law. In addition to teaching and producing a rich body of scholarship in these areas, she has been actively involved in the policy development of these fields. Professor Jefferson has testified before Congress and briefed congressional staff on employee benefits and tax topics. She also currently serves as an expert on taxation to the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See of the United Nations. Please welcome Professor Jefferson for the Mary Beer of Justice lecture on the use of tax policy to promote justice and human dignity.
Well, thank you, Henry, for that very kind introduction, and good afternoon. I would like to begin by thanking the Guild of Catholic Lawyers for selecting me to give this 2021 Mirror of Justice lecture. I truly am honored to be recognized by the Guild for my contributions in clarifying and advancing the pursuit of peace with justice through the law, and to have the opportunity to speak to you on the topic, the use of tax policy to promote justice and human dignity. It is great to be here today, especially to be here in person. Being a lawyer is a noble profession. It presents tremendous opportunities as well as responsibilities to serve society and humanity on many different levels. Regardless of the specialty one selects or the sector in which one chooses to practice, lawyers are able to use their influence and training to promote justice and human dignity in a variety of ways. In some areas of the law, the connection of human rights is obvious. In others, this connection may not be as apparent. Whenever I mention to people that I teach a course in tax policy and human rights in our International Human Rights Summer Law Program in Rome, Italy, or that much of my scholarship focuses on matters related to the dignity of the elderly, or that I serve as a tax expert to the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the United Nations, I frequently am asked to explain the relationship of taxation and tax policy to human rights. Therefore, I have concluded that the connection between human dignity and taxation may not be as apparent as it is with other areas. And so for this reason, I will begin my remarks with an overview of the important role of taxation and tax policy in society, and an explanation of how that role relates to considerations outside traditional economic theory, such as income inequality, justice, and human dignity. In the second part of my remarks, I will address how I have used my teaching, scholarship, and service to promote justice and human dignity throughout my professional career. While there are technical definitions of human rights, when I use the term human rights in the context of my lecture today, I am broadly referring to a person's rights to essential goods, to have the opportunity to flourish, and to be protected against harm, which are affirmed by the corresponding responsibilities of both individuals and society to respect, protect, and promote these rights. I believe it is fair to say that the economic and social impact of the tax law is unrivaled by any other area of the law. In terms of economic impact, the United States Department of Commerce estimates that the payment of taxes in all forms claims to 29.8% of gross domestic product. In other words, when all of the taxes that are paid in the United States are annually tallied, that is, individual income taxes, corporate income taxes, property taxes, Social Security taxes, and sales and excise taxes, Americans spend approximately 30% of their income on taxes. With taxes claiming almost $1 in every 3, it should not be surprising that the tax law commands a great deal of attention and also profoundly affects those making decisions related to the social, public, and humanitarian concerns. This is because tax policy is used not only as a means of raising revenue, but also of encouraging activities that are consistent with certain public policy interests. Tax policy also is used as a way of relieving various forms of hardship and also addressing the needs of the poor. The provisions of the tax law that perform these functions are referred to as tax expenditures. These provisions have substantial economic effect. They also reflect a set of societal beliefs that certain activities are so important to both individuals and society that they warrant public subsidies. For example, because home ownership is believed by policymakers in the United States to produce desirable social economic outcomes, it is vigorously encouraged by a variety of forms of favorable tax treatment. This treatment explains, at least in part, why the home ownership rate in America is relatively high among first world countries. Also, because poverty is considered a public policy matter, there are numerous tax provisions designed to benefit the working poor, such as the Earned Income Tax Credit, better known as the EITC, and the Child Tax Credit. These tax benefits can significantly boost a family's disposable income and lift it above the poverty line. Many of the issues that arise in connection with the social programs supported by the tax system relate to questions about the types of activities that government should or should not support, distributive justice, and fairness, all of which are bedrock principles of any human rights regime. Thus, tax policy is a critical component of many human rights considerations undertaken by policymakers because it can have significant impact on the use of resources as well as quality of life issues. Moreover, depending on how regressive or progressive a tax is, it can alter the distribution of resources within and between countries, which in turn can entrench or alleviate social, economic, and political disparities, both domestically and internationally. This fact explains why encouraging the use of sustainable tax policy and tax administration is an important tool used by the United Nations to tackle some of the most pressing social, economic, and environmental challenges that developing countries face. It also explains why tax policy often is at the center stage, both nationally and internationally, of certain political, economic, and moral debates. It may be surprising that tax policy also not only affects policymakers' decisions, but many of the decisions that we as individuals make. Taxes can impact our employment choices, the forms of compensation we receive, when we retire, and the savings vehicles that we select. For example, whether one chooses to save for retirement in a personal savings account or an employer-sponsored retirement savings arrangement can be largely driven by tax considerations. Therefore, tax policy plays a significant role in all of our lives. This makes it important for all individuals to have some understanding and some appreciation for some of the fundamental considerations relating to tax policy. The term tax policy covers a wide range of considerations and functions, and its definition can vary among disciplines and focus areas. For example, a political scientist might say that tax policy includes all public policy concerns, to the extent that they either create or reduce the need for government revenue. An economist might tell you that tax policy provides criteria to examine the given public and economic goals of a society in terms of production and distribution. And a philosopher may say because government has a moral obligation to generate resources for the realization of the economic, social, and cultural rights of their citizens, tax policy is simply a tool to be used to redistribute national resources in efforts to address humanitarian and other obligations. Thus, there are different views about the function and purpose of tax policy. At the core of all of these definitions, however, is the fact that tax policy, like human rights law, is about the relationship between individuals and the state. Also, at the core of these definitions is the recognition that tax policy can be used very effectively to advance social, economic, moral, and humanitarian goals. Of course, the other side of this relationship also must be considered. If used improperly, tax policy can have harmful and destructive effects. Therefore, having an understanding of the basic principles of tax policy is useful in avoiding negative outcomes and other unintended consequences. For example, setting a tax level too high to raise revenue can have the unintended consequence of discouraging people from working. This response ultimately could shrink rather than expand the tax base. There are many topics and issues considered in ongoing tax policy debates. Concern about the loss of revenue in connection with certain tax rules and tax abuses have been prominent in tax policy debates in recent years. At the forefront of these discussions are corporate tax scandals and the use of tax havens by wealthy taxpayers to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. There also has been continued consideration of whether the tax rates for individuals and/or corporations should be increased or decreased. Although there has been extensive discussion about these persisting issues in the context of traditional economic theory and social policy, there has been far less written about these principles in the context of human rights principles. More specifically, relatively little has been written about how tax design and implementation can promote greater economic equality, the dignity of the human person, and a more equitable distribution of tax resources. However, due to a confluence of economic and social events, this has begun to change. In the aftermath of an international financial crisis, a global pandemic, and rising economic inequality across the world, there is increasing recognition that tax laws and their underlying policies matter for human rights. This perspective reflects the understanding that the exercise of civil and political rights hinges on the protection of economic, social, and cultural rights. In other words, it is difficult for anyone to believe that the protection of civil and political rights can be fully realized if an individual lacks the means to obtain basic necessities such as food, shelter, and healthcare. For this reason, under human rights law, governments have a moral obligation to generate the maximum available resources for the progressive realization of economic, social, and cultural rights of their citizens. Because taxation plays a fundamental role in redistributing national resources to address economic inequalities, it is not uncommon for governments to use tax policy to assist them in providing protection of human rights for marginalized groups. The treatment of the elderly population illustrates this type of response. Throughout the world, seniors disproportionately face discrimination in employment, discrimination in access to credit, abuse in the home, and violence in public arenas. These occurrences, which often go unreported, can cause tremendous human suffering. As a result, a body of international human rights law emerged that explicitly focuses on the rights of the aged. In the United States, which is one of the richest countries in the world, we also face challenges regarding the promotion and protection of human rights for our elderly population. It is estimated that over 4 million seniors currently live under the poverty line in the United States, while millions more live just above the federal poverty level. These numbers represent as much as 45% of the senior population. The impact of poverty is especially devastating in old age when individuals often are no longer able to work. Therefore, it is critically important to assist people who are currently working to save adequate amounts for retirement so that they are able to have a dignified life when they're elderly. This situation prompts an ongoing policy debate regarding the need for pension reform, and more specifically, how to better structure the preferential tax treatment of retirement plans to respond to this crisis. To do this, it is clear that policymakers must consider not only the economic implications of this problem, but also the moral ones. Levels of taxation and tax rate structure are critical variables in any tax policy consideration. This is because these variables determine who bears the relevant tax burdens. All taxes can be placed in one of three main categories: progressive, proportional, and regressive. The primary concept underlying a progressive tax is the ability to pay. A progressive tax requires higher income individuals to pay higher shares of their incomes in taxes. The philosophy behind progressive taxes is that higher income people can afford to provide a larger share of public service than those who are less able to pay. Notably, the idea of progressivity is reflected in Holy Scripture, which states, "From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required, and from the one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded." The concept of progressivity also is fundamental to the Catholic Church's theology. It reflects the Church's belief in the universal destination of goods, which says that all things are meant for the common use of everyone and must be used in a manner consistent with the Church's teachings regarding the stewardship of all created gifts. This bedrock principle of Catholic social teaching drives every aspect of what the Church has said regarding the management, use, and ownership of property. As stewards, we have an obligation to serve the common good in all things, and taxation is an example of this responsibility. Thus, the concept of progressivity includes, but is not limited to, taxation and tax policy. In contrast to a progressive tax is a proportional tax, which also is referred to as a flat tax. A flat tax affects low, middle, and high-income individuals relatively equally. All pay the same rate regardless of income. In terms of actual impact, however, because of the diminishing marginal utility of income, which means that a dollar has less and less relative value as an individual's income rises, a proportional tax may in fact burden low-income workers more. For example, a tax of 10% on a person who earns $15,000 or a tax of $1,500 arguably is more burdensome than a 10% tax on a person who earns $150,000 or a tax of $15,000. This is because each subsequent dollar of income satisfies fewer and fewer urgent needs and wants. Under a regressive tax structure, low-income individuals pay a higher amount of taxes compared to higher-income ones. Accordingly, a regressive tax objectively burdens low-income individuals more than it does middle and high-income people. An example of a regressive tax is the Social Security tax, which applies a rate of 6.2% on all wages up to the current wage cap of $142,000. No tax applies to wages in excess of this cap. Accordingly, wages in excess of the cap are effectively taxed at a rate of 0%. Determining the structure of taxes raises a host of concerns about equity, which is an important criterion used to evaluate a just tax. This is the case regardless of the type of tax or whether the tax has domestic or international application. While there is a consensus about the concept of equity being central to any tax system, there still is much debate regarding what equity means in the context of tax policy. This is because tax equity, like beauty, lies in the eyes of the beholder. Accordingly, there are many different definitions, standards, and perspectives regarding what constitutes an equitable or fair tax. The pursuit of fairness is pervasive and not unique to tax policy considerations. References to fairness are prevalent in everyday uses as well as in the professional formulations of lawyers, economists, philosophers, and theologians. Examples of different points of view on the meaning of fairness are reflected in lengthy definitions found in the dictionary. Some of the definitions of fair found in American College Dictionary include: 1, having or exhibiting a disposition that is free of favoritism or bias, impartial. 2, just to all parties, equitable. And 3, consistent with rules, logic, and ethics. Notions regarding the meaning of fairness also can be seen in numerous commonplace expressions. For example, the idiom fair and square is defined as just and honest, while the idiom no fair means something contrary to the rules. The connotation of fairness also varies among disciplines. When economists make judgments about fairness, they often invoke the concept of equity. As it applies to matters of taxation and tax burdens in particular, equity historically has meant equal treatment of equals. To discriminate among equal classes of taxpayers is viewed as arbitrary, capricious, and generally wrong. Furthermore, discriminatory treatment is viewed as unjust, partial, and inconsistent with logic. Accordingly, if two taxpayers have identical incomes, the doctrine of equity implies that each should pay identical amounts of taxes. This concept is referred to as horizontal equity by economists. Similarly, another form of equity dictates that appropriate distinctions should be made among taxpayers who are differently situated. Economists refer to this concept as vertical equity. Therefore, if one household has twice as much income as another, equity dictates that the tax burdens for these two households should not be the same. For sure, reasonable minds can differ as to how that difference should be structured, and also how much that difference should be. However, as a matter of fairness, most would agree that the tax law should not impose the same tax burdens on these two households. In law, equity has a different and more specific meaning. Equity refers to justice applied in circumstances covered by the law, which are influenced by principles of ethics and fairness. As applied to the example of the two households with identical income, in law, a just tax system may require a reduction in the tax burden of a family who incurred heavy medical expenditures or suffered the ravages of a storm, as compared to another family who had not had unexpected expenditures. Therefore, in law, applying different tax rates to two families having the same income with different situations is fair, whereas applying different rates with circumstances that are similar is unfair. Human rights law addresses the issue of fairness in even different terms. Here, the focus is on the state having adequate resources to meet their human rights obligations, and also rest upon principles of human dignity, community values, and the government aiding those who are unable to avail themselves to minimum provisions for an adequate standard of living. It is interesting to note that the human rights view has additional complexity in the international tax arena. In developing countries in particular, the ability of wealthy residents and multinational corporations to avoid or evade taxation is directly linked to violations of human rights. This is especially true to the extent that these practices negatively impact the country's ability to protect social and economic rights like education and health. Therefore, assisting these countries with the means to fight back and collect revenue is essential in advancing human rights. The contemporary Catholic Church has addressed a myriad of aspects about taxation and tax policy, including what constitutes a just tax structure. The clearest and most extensive statement on tax policy came in the United States Bishop's Pastoral Letter on Economic Justice for All, written in 1986. In this letter, the bishop said that, quote, the tax system should be continually evaluated in terms of its impact on the poor, close quote, and then enunciated the following three principles to guide these evaluations. The first principle is that the tax system should raise sufficient revenue to pay for the public needs of society, especially those that address the basic needs of the poor. The second principle is that the tax system should be structured according to the principles of progressivity, so that those with relatively greater financial resources pay a higher rate of taxation, which is a means of reducing the severe inequalities in income and wealth that exist today. The third principle is that families below the official poverty line should not be required to pay income taxes because they are, by definition, without resources to purchase the basic necessities of life. Economic justice for all echoed an earlier statement made by Pope John XXIII in 1961, in which he said, as regards to taxation, assessment according to ability to pay is fundamental to a just and equitable system. Therefore, tax policy is complex, with different disciplines and philosophies focusing on different aspects of what is fair. The function of tax policy can be equally complex, however. This is because the tax rules and regulations are designed to both raise revenue and to support certain social and public programs. Notwithstanding their complexity, the tax rules and their underlying policies can be used very effectively to respond to economic, social, and moral obligations by both individuals and policymakers in very meaningful ways. In my remaining time, I will speak about how I, through my teaching, scholarship, and service, have used tax policy to promote justice and human dignity domestically and internationally over my career. I regularly teach 3 courses in taxation: federal income taxation, partnership taxation, and tax policy, a course in pension law. In these classes, we examine the American tax law as it relates to the individual, partnership, and the private retirement system, respectively. I also teach a course in tax policy and human rights in our International Human Rights Summer Law program in Rome, Italy, in which we explore the relationship of certain tax expenditures to international human rights principles. Because of the importance of tax policy, in all of these courses I expose students not only to the Black letter law, but also to their underlying tax policy considerations. I believe that understanding of and an appreciation for relevant tax policy considerations is important for several reasons. One, having an understanding of tax policy enables students to appreciate the practical, ethical, and moral considerations that a tax system should strive to address, as well as the principles of fairness that any just system should reflect. Therefore, when they are called upon to make decisions in tax matters or even in cross-disciplinary exchanges, they will be in a better position to analyze, evaluate, and critique the breadth of issues that taxation and tax policy involve. Two, exposure to tax policy also prepares students for the tax issues that they will face in their professional and personal lives by giving them a better understanding of why the black letter law is structured as it is. This understanding broadens the range of legal considerations and principles that they will bring to bear if they are in positions to evaluate or design tax policies and the various federal regulations that advance them. And three, it is important for students to be familiar with tax policy concepts to help them understand that tax policy is public policy, and tax policy is social policy, and also tax policy is human rights policy. Recognizing these equivalences is important because all taxpayers and voters are moral actors in society, directly affected by the choices policymakers make regarding tax policies and the use of tax revenue derived from the taxes that they pay. Not only do I focus on tax policy in the classroom, but also in my scholarship. In the articles that I have written, I consider a wide range of issues relating to taxation, retirement, and income inequality. Although the range of topics that I research is wide, a common theme that exists in my scholarship is using the tax law to encourage policymakers to find measures of increasing retirement security so that workers across the income spectrum will have adequate resources for a life of dignity when they are old. One of my most recent articles is titled, "Let Them Eat Cake," examining United States retirement savings policies through the lens of international human rights principles. This article uses an international human rights framework to analyze and critique the effectiveness of the United States retirement system and its underlying policies. The article challenges the ongoing pension reform debate to consider concepts outside traditional economic theory, such as income inequality, the dignity of the elderly, and the irreducible mutuality of people in their search for solutions to the problem of too few workers today having saved sufficient amounts for financially secure retirements. Although human rights analysis will not yield a precise policy prescription for the retirement savings crisis, it can contribute to the scholarly debate on pension reform by introducing an additional framework against which the government's economic and social policies regarding the treatment of the elderly can be evaluated. It is my hope that this article will result in an expansion of the focus and range of policymakers' considerations regarding pension and tax policy, and lead to more workers in this country having financially secure retirements. Over the course of my career, I also have consistently looked for opportunities to promote justice and human dignity in my service as a practical way of bringing my teaching philosophy and my scholarship together. I've sat on executive boards on numerous organizations that in one form or another explore ways of using tax policy to ensure retirement security for all workers in this country. These positions frequently involve a re-examination of the goals and limits of existing federal limits and income tax policy with respect to our tax rules. I also have had opportunities to testify before Congress and various advisory groups. In these settings, I have conveyed similar concern about the effectiveness of the United States private retirement system and have encouraged policymakers to make significant pension and tax reform in this regard. In January of 2018, I was invited to become an expert of the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the United Nations, which has given me an opportunity to consider tax policy in scholarly contexts that are new to me, in an international forum and from the perspective of the Catholic Church. This work has proven to be both interesting and rewarding. In my remaining time, I will speak about the work of the Holy See Mission and also my work for the mission as a tax expert. By way of background, the name Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the United Nations has historical significance. In 1929, the Holy See and Italy signed the Lateran Treaty, which brought into existence Vatican City State. The State of Vatican City is a physical setting that possesses a presence under international law. The term Holy See refers to the Pope as a supreme authority of the Roman Catholic Church. It also refers to its function as the central government of the Catholic Church. Under international law and practice, the Holy See has a legal identity that allows it to enter into treatises as a juridical equal of the state, and also to send and receive diplomatic representatives. Therefore, it is the Holy See that internationally represents Vatican City State. In fact, when the Holy See enters into an agreement for Vatican City State, it uses the phrase, acting on behalf and in the interest of the State of Vatican City. To avoid misunderstandings in its dealings with the United Nations, a formal agreement was signed in 1957, providing that all United Nations relations would be made between the Holy See and the United Nations. Accordingly, it is the Holy See that is represented by the delegations accredited by the Secretary of State to international organizations. The Holy See is a very active participant in international diplomacy. It is present at United Nations headquarters in New York, at United Nations centers abroad, and at other international organizations. Currently, the Holy See maintains full diplomatic relations with nearly all 193 member countries. As stated in its charter, the primary mission of the United Nations are peace and peaceful resolution of conflicts, fundamental human rights, the care of the environment and development, and respect for international law and treaties. Because all of these matters are at the core of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church, the Holy See mission pays close attention to the work of the United Nations. Through this forum, the Holy See mission is able to provide spiritual inspiration as well as to share a wide breadth of its experiences with the United Nations. In this way, the mission assists the organization in its realization of peace, justice, human dignity, and humanitarian cooperation. And at the same time, it enables the Church to influence international relations and debates regarding the important human, social, and ethical issues that currently challenge the world. When Pope Benedict XXVI visited the United Nations in 2008, he stated, quote, "My presence at this assembly is a sign of esteem for the United Nations, and it is intended to express the hope that the organization will increasingly serve as a sign of unity between states and an instrument of service to the entire human family." By its own choice, the Holy See enjoys the status of permanent observer state at the United Nations rather than as a full member state. This decision was made by the Holy See so that it can maintain absolute neutrality on certain political issues. At the time that this decision was made, the Holy See was the only permanent observer. Since that time, however, the state of Palestine was granted permanent observer state status, which makes it the second state currently holding the status. States with permanent observer status have the same rights to participate in the general debate of the United Nations General Assembly. The only explicit limitation to the role of a state with permanent observer status as compared to a member state is the right to vote, to submit resolutions without co-sponsors, and to put forth candidates for office. Accordingly, when countries seek official contact with the permanent observer mission of the Holy See, it is for spiritual and inspirational support. Therefore, through the United Nations Forum, the Holy See is able to act as a voice of conscience at the service of the common good by drawing attention to the ethical and religious aspects of various questions affecting the lives of people, nations, and the international community. For this reason, in its relations with the United Nations, it is often said that the Holy See exercises soft power diplomacy, meaning diplomacy which does not depend on military, political, or economic strength, but on its ability to persuade and inspire. The Holy See mission is headed by the Apostolic Nuncio, who is the Vatican representative accredited as an ambassador. He is responsible for promoting good relations between the government and the Holy See and reporting on relevant conditions. The Apostolic Nuncio and the mission are assisted by diplomats and a support team comprising attachés of the mission, interns, and external experts. External experts serve the mission on a part-time basis and provide assistance on matters within their areas of expertise. Experts are recruited and selected on the basis of numerous factors, including their knowledge of Catholic social teaching, their familiarity with the position of the Holy See within their specific field of competence, and their professional standing. Experts are required to attend many different types of meetings during their service to the mission, and writing reports is an integral part of their responsibilities. The purpose of these reports is to summarize meetings, discussions, to focus on emerging trends and themes, and to identify new developments. Experts also are asked to pay special attention to any critical or controversial issues that pertain to the specific interests of the Holy See. Tax matters currently are at the forefront of many of the issues considered by international organizations, including the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, the World Bank, and the United Nations. These organizations are now calling on governments around the world to strengthen and increase the effectiveness of their tax systems in order to generate the domestic resources needed to meet sustainable developmental goals and also to promote inclusive economic growth. Tax revenue is critical to sustainable development as it provides governments with revenue for investing in development, reducing poverty, and delivering public services. Tax revenue also increases the state's capacity to function independently and to be more accountable and responsible to its citizens. As a tax expert for the Holy See Mission, I've attended numerous meetings dealing with tax policy that address these pressing humanitarian issues. The focus of international tax meetings is often on identifying ways of strengthening both domestic and international tax systems as a means of meeting sustainable development goals in specific contexts such as environment or the digital economy. These goals can be particularly challenging for developing countries that struggle to raise sufficient revenue to provide basic services such as road infrastructure, healthcare, and public safety. Research shows that at least 15% of gross domestic product in revenue is necessary to finance a country's basic services. However, in almost 30 of the 75 poorest countries in the world, tax revenue is significantly below the 15% threshold. For numerous reasons, developing countries face formidable challenges in establishing efficient tax systems. One reason for these challenges is that many of their workers are employed in agriculture or in small informal enterprises. As a result, workers often are not paid regular wages. Their earnings also typically fluctuate and may even be paid in cash or in off-the-books transactions. Therefore, the base for an income tax is very difficult to calculate under these circumstances. Another difficulty these countries face is that they often lack well-trained tax administrators because they do not have sufficient resources to pay fair wages or to computerize their operations. As a result, governments frequently take paths of least resistance, developing tax systems that allow them to exploit whatever options are available rather than establishing rational, modern, and efficient tax systems. Also, because of the informal structure of the economy in many developing countries, tax offices have difficulty generating reliable statistics. This lack of data prevents their policymakers from being able to assess the potential impact of major changes in their tax systems. Consequently, marginal changes are often selected over major structural changes, even when the latter are clearly preferable. This practice, unfortunately, perpetuates inefficient tax structures. In efforts to help developing countries achieve sustainable goals, it is necessary for governments to work together in establishing a fair and efficient system of international taxation, including efforts to fight tax evasion and tax avoidance. Equally important is the need for all countries, developed as well as developing, to be more aware of tax spillovers from their tax practices and policies. The term tax spillovers refers to the impact that one country's tax policies and rules have on another country, or from one form of tax to another form within the same country. The concept of spillover is premised on the idea that some tax policies and practices can spill over to harm the base of other taxes or other countries by reducing tax revenue. A 2014 study conducted by the IMF estimated revenue losses from spillovers as being as high as 13% in non-OECD countries. Therefore, strengthening a country's tax system and tax administration is not just a matter of raising revenue. It also is about designing a tax system that promotes inclusiveness encourages good governance, responds to society's concerns about income inequalities, and promotes social justice. All of these concerns are consistent with the goals of the Holy See and Catholic social teaching. Archbishop Kasha, who is the current Apostolic Nuncio and permanent observer of the Holy See to the United Nations, recently addressed the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly on macroeconomics policy questions. In his remarks, he said that the main goal of macroeconomic policy is to, quote, promote sustainable and inclusive economic growth, fair international trade, and the participation of countries, notably developing countries, in the global economy, close quote. Because all of these require national resources, they have significant tax policy implications. Also, because taxes remain the preeminent means through which governments raise revenue to deliver essential public goods and services, it is necessary to explore ways of making the tax system more effective and efficient in developing countries. The Nuncio also stated that the list of global goals should include measures to support economic recovery aimed at regaining the ground lost due to the COVID-19 pandemic. He further explained that the economics of developing countries have been hit hardest by the pandemic because these countries do not have the resources needed to respond to large-scale events. He observed that improving the productive capabilities of the least developed countries is necessary to eradicate poverty and to improve their productive capabilities. Therefore, the pandemic has heightened the need for more tax revenue and more sustainable tax systems throughout the world. In his remarks, Archbishop Kasha quoted Pope Francis, who in a letter to the participants of the 2021 spring meeting of the World Bank stated, quote, a spirit of global solidarity demands at least a significant reduction in the debt burden of the poorest nations, which has been exacerbated by the pandemic. Relieving the burden of debt of so many countries and communities today is a profoundly human gesture that can help people to develop and to have access to vaccines, healthcare, education, and jobs. Close quote. This statement reflects the Church's view that eliminating poverty, increasing economic access for the poor, and providing support for sustainable development in poor countries are human gestures. And as a practical matter, all of these goals will need to be supported by more equitable and effective tax rules and policies. I will conclude by saying that the effective use of tax policy is one of the many ways in which a more just distribution of the goods of this world can be achieved. Taxation is about much more than raising revenue. The tax rules and their underlying policies can be designed to serve the common good. They also can be used very effectively in support of behavior and activities that promote justice and human dignity. Over my career, which has spanned 3 decades, it has been gratifying for me to be able to do this through my teaching, scholarship, and service. And I look forward to having more opportunities to do so in the years ahead. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Jefferson, for that excellent lecture. We do have a little memento for you.
Thank you so much.
Everyone, thank you for coming today to this year's Mary Mirror of Justice lecture, and thank you again